Hey everybody, how are you? I want to just talk a little bit today about a concept that I've just been playing with myself. And play really is an accurate word in this because it does involve a certain amount of playfulness. And the concept is really just this idea of control versus participation, right? So often we kind of have this sort of option, I feel, in life. And the modern world really um, is kind of obsessed with control. Our lives to a certain extent and our civilization is really optimized for prediction and and messiness is really kind of considered um, dangerous, taboo, or even a sign of kind of immaturity. What I want to talk about here is this idea that ancient cultures didn't try and control reality. They danced with it, right? And if you think about this, we kind of life becomes a much more playful experience when we move through it, not trying to manage it, but just inhabiting the mystery. So, and you might even notice this at a very kind of a local level in your interpersonal stuff, how tension emerges in your relationships when you are managing your relationships, when you are controlling the people around you, when you can stay in this place of, how can I just participate in the mystery? How can I just flow through this, dance through this? My partner and I, we always talk about this idea of when we notice a kind of a tightening in the reality around us, we go, okay, let's dance. And by that, we just kind of invite chaos, we invite illogical solutions, and we just participate. We flow. I know that in the past, my tendency, which was born from a deep insecurity and a lack of trust in the universe itself, my tendency would have been to control and to manage and to force. And I'm noticing that as I get older and as my, I want to call it like my spiritual e- education deepens and becomes more of a lived experience, that I'm recognizing I can dance and I can flow. And that is just creating a much more enjoyable experience for me. And one thing that I've started to do is I used to use the word the universe as a sort of a placeholder for God, even a placeholder for the things that I could not tangibly put my finger on, the things that I couldn't quite explain, the living consciousness that we all find ourselves in. But I've switched recently. I now call it the imagination, and by calling it the imagination, it already kind of lends to a different perception, if that makes sense. When I begin to look on life as the unfolding of imagination, it I tend to just I notice there is a somatic change in me. My shoulders drop. I become more relaxed. I become more trusting. If I can view everything that's happening around me as the unfolding of imagination at large, then it all feels more kind of plastic to me. It feels more malleable. I feel like, oh, I can I can start to just move with this. I can dance. Again, it's that whole idea of just dancing, right? Terence McKenna is a big influence for me on some of these ideas, and he really talked about this idea that we need to stop looking on nature as our enemy. It's not something that we need to conquer. We need to begin to just start to look on nature as ourselves. We are nature. We are part, an element of the great imagination. And therefore, the next logical, or not even logical, the next creative decision is just to explore that, to explore ourselves. And there's something too, like when you consider our birth, right? And you consider that initial initiation, um, of when we arrive on the planet and we first, we leave our mother's body and we're breathing air and we're often in these horrible, sterile, uncomfortable, non-sacred environments, which are the hospitals that so many of us are born in. And it's terrifying. And from then on, from that point on, we are drilled with this idea that we must control our environment. And so there is this sort of the game that we are thrust into is like survival. And a big part of my work and a big part of the work that I just do with other people is trying to help them step out of survival as a game. And even to introduce the idea, and it's not easy to introduce it. Often we need some sort of psychedelic breakdown, or we need um, even a physiological breakdown or something in order to see that, okay, there is this game called survival, but there is another game just called playful participation. And last night I was teaching a workshop over here in Ireland, and I was splitting people into little groups, groups of threes, groups of fours, and the numbers were uneven. So I took part, I participated. And this often happens. And I was participating with a woman who had a double breast cancer 3 years ago. She had a double breast cancer, an incredibly difficult period in her life. And it brought about a complete change in her worldview. She stepped out of this place of control, of managing, and just dropped into chaos. She understood that in order to survive the cancer that was in her body, she had to embrace chaos. There's a lovely kind of there's a very ancient framing of this in both in the two Greek gods, Apollo and Dionysus, right? And Apollo, his whole idea was sort of reason and structure, and Dionysus was ecstasy and dissolution, right? And they're just two ways, as explored by mythology, of approaching the world. And I think when we move too much into the ecstasy and dissolution, when we move too much into the Dionysian side, it it becomes very hard to navigate in the world. I think this is the typical thing of the classic like broke artist. They fall into this Dionysian kind of pit where just life they just can't function anymore. The Apollonian side, on the other side, the Apollo side, the reason and structure, we know this. I had lunch with a kind of a family member the other day, and there was no magic in this person at all. Everything was structure. And I was in a group of people, and these people were much more kind of feeling centered people. But this family member of mine, this male, was he was trying to wrestle with the conversation. Whenever we would talk about things, and we would sort of say things like, well, the energy at the moment is this, or sometimes you just have to trust. It was a little bit like he couldn't commute. He couldn't compute. He couldn't understand it. But not only could he not understand it, but he couldn't tolerate it. And so he would start to try and bring the conversation to this place of reason and structure. And it felt like two types of music playing in the same room at the same time. And the rest of us who were a little bit more kind of emotionally literate and more feeling centered, and perhaps more compassionate and conscientious and just less competitive with a conversational style, we kind of very patiently allowed him to say his bit, um, and then would return to our thing. And so there's something interesting about this, right? And when you can begin to live your life uh, without trying to manage reality, without trying to control reality, but just playfully participate. I think a great sort of way that you can move about this is just to look for symbols everywhere. This is kind of what I do. This is what the ancient people do. They would see a bird in the sky, and it wasn't a bird in the sky, it was a message. They would see a wind blowing in a certain direction, and they would take it as a direction. This is where astrology comes from. The ancient people looked at the stars and they intuited a blueprint. They saw messages everywhere. And the same thing if you look at like old divination systems, the I Ching and things like this, it came from throwing sticks on the ground and then using those sticks as a sort of a kind of a, a device for just reading internal intuition. So what happens in this in a world like this, what happens in a world of magical participation is we start to become much more present with everything. I notice myself like I kind of in order to step into this sort of participatory flow, it's really important that I am moving at a slow pace. You know, it's really important that I am observing. I don't know if you've ever read any of the works of Carlos Castaneda. Carlos Castaneda was an anthropologist who spent time with a Mexican shaman called Don Juan. Um, and the work is potentially a work of fiction, but it contains in it a lot of these very interesting truths about the magical world we live around. And there's a great quote from Don Juan where it says, "The world is a mystery, and it is not as we think it is. The world we think we know is just a description." So, this kind of idea that, there's a wonderful thing called the desktop theory of reality. And, when you're looking at your desktop on your laptop computer, and you see there are things like folders on the screen. And we know that they're not actually folders, they're symbolic. We see documents there. We know that that's not actually a document, it's a symbol. And we open up those symbols and it gives us something else. And I think you can begin to kind of explore reality in this symbolic way. Like I tend to, um, I if something happens to me by chance, I'll imbue it with great meaning. Um, I won't just say, "Well, that's interesting that that happened twice. That's interesting that that person mentioned that thing to me that I was thinking of this morning." I will always look on it as some sort of echoes from the collective imagination trying to seed some sort of thought in me. Um, yeah. And so this idea um, is often kind of scary for us. I think we are raised to be people who control, you know, people who take care of things, people who have an answer to things. In particular, like in those of us in masculine bodies, there is a kind of a pressure placed on us to always be in control. This is why men um, have such difficulty admitting when they're wrong, because to admit, oh, I've been wrong, is to acknowledge that you are chaotic too. So men are often very, very defensive when it comes to making mistakes or not knowing things. This is why often in many situations there will always be um, men in middle management and so on who make decisions when they don't know what's actually going on. And the reason they're making a decision is because they're so afraid to not be able to make a decision because that is opening up the lid on their own internal chaos. But Nietzsche said this thing, and one must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star. So part of our work here is being brave enough to acknowledge chaos. This is the thing I like to do when I'm driving, and sometimes it infuriates my partner, and maybe my partner is more masculine than I am. But I like to drive places and not use Google Maps. And sometimes I make mistakes. And she'll say, "Why don't you just use maps?" And I said, "Well, I feel too controlled when I'm following a map. If I'm just following memory and I'm exercising the navigational capacities of my hippocampus, then I feel that there's still something instinctive and animalistic and Dionysian and chaotic about me." And of course, it doesn't end up in a big argument. It's normally just a matter of humor and her laughing at me. Um, but this is sort of, again, it's just a sort of an attempt, and I will quite often in my days, I will go for walks, I will call this walk just a participatory. I can never fully pronounce that participatory walk, where I will just move outside without a phone and kind of allow winds to take me in certain direction. Much like a magpie, I'll follow shiny things. I'll just be moved by an internal compass, which can feel chaotic and can often feel somehow unsatisfactory. I won't end up anywhere exciting. I won't feel like I've completed a task. I'll feel like I had just gone for a walk and been brought in circles and eventually come home tired. But what this does for me, and I feel there's a huge shamanic quality in this, is that it is feeding the chaotic animal inside me. And what I'll notice so often when I do these little walks is that I will somehow be led to beauty, be it a tree that I've never seen, be it a building with like a very ornate kind of architecture, be it a vista, something like that. And I feel what's happening in these situations when I cede control and I just participate is that my soul takes me on a walk to encounter beauty. And I want to end this little piece with a quote from D.H. Lawrence. And he said, "The human soul needs actual beauty even more than it needs bread." So the beauty is in the chaos. And maybe learning to just participate with life and be brought on a journey rather than manage and control it is the way to come back to trust. All right. Thanks for listening. Hope you're all well and lots of love.